everybody. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bicassa. Today, we have Evan Jones on the show. Evan is a full-time blogger for the Orvis Corporation and has really built up a repertoire of great articles associated to that. But his articles have been surrounded by his experience, and his experience is extremely extensive. And we're going to talk about some of those areas today. Number one, you wrote a book about being a trout bum in Argentina. It's a Trout Bum's Guide to Argentina. Actually, very popular book. Out of print, hard to get, but it is really the guide for Argentina as most people know it. The other thing that you've done is you've lived in the past in Florida and have done quite a bit of saltwater. So you have this really great dynamic of saltwater and freshwater experience. And we're going to leverage that today to help our audience with some really cool information. So we're going to jump into the first half of the show, and that's going to be all about traveling in Argentina, the types of fisheries, etc., and learning a lot about that. And then the second half of the show, our tips area, we're going to talk about what you like to refer to, and I love this, is streams to salt. And that's like, how do you take your stream experience and push it into the salt experience and overcome a lot of A, the obstacles, and B's, the, I don't know, what would you call them? The mental space or the commonalities that people say, hey, oh, you have to overcome this. And it's really not as true as it may be perceived. So, Evan, it's great to have you on the show, my man. Love the art in the background. We were talking about that earlier. You're obviously a very fishy guy. Let's jump into Argentina right away. And why don't you just give us a lay of the land and kind of your thought process of maybe how you started and what you kind of picked up at the very beginning.
So Patagonia is roughly the size of California and Montana put together, just on the Argentina side, just that one section of it. And so I think whenever it always tends to get lumped together, oh, I'm going to go fishing in Patagonia, but nobody would ever just say, oh, I'm just going to go to California. They would. There are
pick a segment, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like 700,000 square miles or something like that. So, and it fishes from November, which is early spring for them, all the way through typically like early May, which is going to be in the fall. And so there's just this huge variety of experiences and focuses and, goals that you can pursue down there. And I think it can be really difficult for anglers to sort of parse that out and figure out, exactly what the differences are, what's the best match for their skill set, for their wish list. And so I'd like to just kind of break it down a little bit, because I feel like most anglers just go and visit one specific spot during one time of year. I've had the luxury of spending 2 whole years and traveling the entire expanse of it twice. And so I have a lot of comparative details, I think, that can help people kind of figure out where to go.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect, because I agree. A lot of people think of, I'm going to go fish Patagonia, and it's like the first few websites they go to, that's their mission. They don't understand necessarily the diversity, or they get into the searching aspect, and it's like, oh my gosh, the diversity. I'm more confused now than I was. What? This is an expensive trip, or it's et cetera. Oh, man, how do I make a decision? And I love how you spent 2 years down there traveling and fishing, but it wasn't just traveling and fishing. Talk a little bit about that. You explored. I mean, you didn't bump from lodge to lodge. You explored the region extensively. So talk about that so everybody has that context.
So just very briefly, I worked for an international NGO that was doing small scale grants in developing countries. So I had contact with people in over 100 different countries. I knew I was going to go somewhere for fishing. I narrowed down Argentina because of its DIY potential and because I spoke Spanish already. So it seemed like a natural fit. So I sold all of my stuff at a garage sale. I broke up with my girlfriend. I quit my job and I bought a one-way ticket. I mean, I really, if I had thought about it more, maybe I wouldn't have done it that way, but it was just kind of like, well, we're going to go. This is great. So I showed up there without any clue about what to do. And I was kind of surprised. The first few fly shops I went to ask for information, their first question was, well, do you have a car? well, no. Well, you're not going to take the bus, dude. Like, I don't know what you're thinking, but
Right.
so my first task, I had to go out and buy a used car in Spanish. I mean, this was a heck of a thing, and I mean that took me a month on its own, and I finally got out, and it's just me. I'm in an old Renault station wagon, and I thought I spoke Spanish. I was dead wrong about this. I did not understand a word they were saying. I'm communicating with pantomimes. I would show up in these towns, and people would just look at me like little kids following me around on their bikes, and like scattering when I would turn to talk to them. I mean, it was it was a real. I was just making it up as I went, and honestly, if I had known how absurd and how just out of my element it was going to be at the time, I don't think I would have gone. I kind of got there and just got rolled into this, and then was just like, I guess I'm sleeping in my car in a national park now, like in the middle of nowhere. I sure hope it starts tomorrow morning, like because I haven't seen another person in a couple days, type of situation.
Right.
So I mean, this really, and this did not start as a book deal. It wasn't like I went down there with the mission to write a book. I was just I don't know what I was doing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it wasn't until
But
I met.
it turned in all that from what you probably learned in the first week, right? Of like, oh my
Yeah,
gosh, I'm a little over my head,
yeah.
and I bet there's a lot of people who thought like I did and ended up where I'm at right now, etc. And boy, that might be something for the future. So you
Yeah,
wrote the book. I mean,
yeah, right. I met some guy down there from Washington, my buddy Barrett, and he was the one who got the book deal for us. And the rest of that is kind of history. But it was interesting because even the guides that we would talk to at a lot of these lodges, who had extensive experience in their area, had never even fished like in the neighboring river basin because they get
hmm,
so focused on their job. They have
hmm,
a limited amount of time. It's all dedicated to work, and so it was remarkable how much depth there was of information available, but how little breadth.
hmm, hmm. That is unique. Yeah.
It,
Because most people like you do know, I mean, you go to Colorado, for example, they're like, oh, I know the frying pan. I know this. I know that. I know that. Or you go to California, same thing, Washington. You can go down the list. But what was for you when you saw that? What was the obstacle? Was it the time element or was it really just the distance and or being able to get from location to location or the no need like hey I got people coming here to fish my river, I'm just going to stick on my river, it's so good, who cares?
I think so. That last part, I think, is a huge part of it. Like, why go somewhere else when what you've got right in the backyard is so great?
Yeah,
I honestly think that's a big part of it. However,
don't leave fish to get fish, right?
dude, exactly. The one thing I would say about that though is that I think that seasonally, like month to month, not every river is going to be great all year. And
Mhm.
so I think that there's a lot of value in understanding what's going on in neighboring provinces if you're looking at a specific time frame where, for example, January is like the tourist season. Nobody works in Buenos Aires in January. The entire city comes out to Patagonia, it seems like. Um, that can be really great in a way because you get a lot more services. There's going to be more English speakers. There's going to be more buses. There's the
Mm,
restaurants are going to be open later. There's going to be, like kayak rentals and all of that stuff is going to be better. But at the same time, some of those rivers are going to get warm. They're going to get over trafficked. And there are
okay,
like nearby glaciers, for example, where the water's still cold. So in a seasonal respect, I think some of those guides are missing out because they have to be on that water all year. They have to make it work. But tourists aren't restricted by that. So
right, and again they have to make it work. It's still really good fishing
it's
when it's
still
not
yeah.
good fishing,
I
so
mean, yeah, it'll pour them to twist their arm.
right.
But it is important to know what your options are because some
Hmm,
people would prefer to throw dry flies over streamers, and there are
yeah,
some places that are good for both, and sometimes there's not a lot of overlap. So
right, or high plains where it's super windy versus maybe some more wooded areas where you could take away some of that element
some of
if
it, it's
possible.
always going to be windy, man.
Yeah, right.
It'll make
Thank
you a better caster. I mean, it
right,
really
right.
like it really improved, and it'll change your whole perception of what's windy. I can go out on a 10-mile-an-hour day now, and I don't even notice. Like
Yeah,
that's
and
not
your technique. Maybe I'm going to swing flies today, or maybe I'm going to use a different technique because I'm not going to battle the wind with this other scenario or
exactly,
style.
exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about that Argentina regionally, give a little bit of mind map on that. And then if you could break it down to from the mind map of regionality to the options as well regarding like species and things like that.
Okay, so it's a huge area, and it's obviously going to be a little tough to break down. But to do it really generically, I would break it into the northern region, the central region, and the southern region.
Okay.
The northern region is going to be mostly Neuquén province. That's San Martín de los Andes, Junín de los Andes, and then the northern city of Illuminé. If you're keeping track of things like that, you're going to have a lot of rivers there that are very close together. You could easily fish 2 in a day, for example. They're going to be smaller, stonier. There's a lot more insect life there.
Mm-hmm.
The water tends to be clearer. So if what you're looking for is kind of an analog to Western fishing maybe 50 or 100 years ago, the northern region is definitely the place where you're going to want to be.
Okay.
Now, I will say that it tends to get more tourists. And so if you're looking for a trip in January or February, your options are going to be a little bit limited. I think, in my opinion, the northern region fishes well early in the season and late in the season. I would do like
Okay.
November, December there. I would do March, April there. January is just tough.
It's tough because of the pressure and more people, or tough because the bug life takes a dive as
All of
well,
the
or
above.
all
All
of
of
the
the
above?
above. The water gets too warm. Some of the rivers get too low to float. Um,
Okay.
the bug life takes a dive. The tourism ramps up. It's all of the above. And to be clear, you can still go and catch fish and have a great time there.
Right. Right.
It's not ideal. It's
Not
not as good
not
as
a
it could be.
prime time. This is the way you would say
Exactly.
it.
Now, to be fair, you are going to have pretty predictable weather January and February. If you go in early season or late, especially early season, if you try to go in November, let's say, you are really taking your chances with rain. Um,
So
and
you
I mean,
could get a lot
like,
of runoff situation and dirty water and really
no,
foul
no,
your
no,
soil.
the water doesn't get dirty. It's all
Oh,
lakes and it's all natural outlets. So you don't the water will get high, but it's still crystal clear.
okay.
It's actually really cool and it still fishes fairly well. But it can be miserable. I mean, it can just be like 5 days of straight rain, like
Rain and
no, ugh,
sideways rain too.
and clouds and yeah. I mean, it's not going to be as fun. But I mean, that's that's the trade off, right? Nothing's perfect.
Right. The trade off too is if you do get a window of good weather, it sounds like it could be quite prolific from a bug standpoint and everything else. Is that
So
correct?
I recommend going for as long as you can. I know that's easy for me to say. Oh yeah, just take a month, take 2 months, go for it. But the longer you spend there, the higher your chances are of catching one of those windows, and
Mm-hmm.
and that can be just phenomenal. I mean, that can make the whole trip worth it. I've had some
Right.
days on spring creeks in December that are just as memorable as anything could ever be. So
Yeah.
you are taking your chances, but boy, the rewards can be so I'll move on to the southern region here. I don't want to take too much time.
Yeah.
The farther south you go, the less population you're going to see. Just generally, that's a good rule. Just for the entire expanse. Some people think that that's what they want, but it complicates pretty much everything.
Hmm.
If you're doing a DIY trip, the rivers are way farther apart. The roads are like glacial gravel, and I poked a hole in my gas tank at one point, and it took 10 hours for the next car to go by.
Hmm.
And then when they did, they couldn't help me anyway. So like you're really and it happens fast. Everything south, the city of Esquel and Trevelin are right next to each other there in Chubut province, and that's pretty much the southern line for civilization. Once you start to go past that, there's really not that much out there. We got snowed on in February there. I mean, it starts to really get challenging from a DIY perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The rivers they sort of start to transition here. Like I said, they're farther apart. They tend to be a little more like meandering cut bank type of spring creek style, like dirty, like more tannic water,
Mm-hmm.
more like streamers, big stupid terrestrials, stuff like that. You got to be real quiet when you approach the water. Sometimes you're casting from 30 or 40 feet back from the bank because those fish will see you. It it's I think the fish are just generally a little bigger down there. maybe a little farther apart. Like it seems like it's a place where you're going to have fewer fish, but maybe they're going to be more memorable.
Higher
And there's
quality.
yeah, I think so. I mean, and that's all that's opinion, and I mean that can all change, but it does feel like there's a bit of a shift towards quality over quantity as you go south.
Yeah.
It's also important to note that there's a big glacier there, and so the water stays cold, even through January and February. So if you're
Okay.
going to be there in the height of the summer, the Esquel region is definitely where I would want to be. There's fewer tourists, and the water stays colder, so you're just going to get a lot more consistent action throughout that difficult time.
Now, north to south region, the weather pattern pretty much the same, or is it less intense in the south, more intense in the
So
north, vice
as
versa?
you cross from Bariloche is the heart of the Lake District, and that's sort of right in between these two areas. As you
Okay.
cross from Bariloche to Esquel, you actually go over the Continental Divide. It's
Okay.
deceptively high, steep, dangerous. On the Esquel side, the mountains are lower between Argentina and Chile, so I feel like the weather's more intense. It can
Hmm.
come up faster. The wind is stronger. We had definitely like sketchier days there, fewer good days. Um, in some places, like you just never see the sun. It's just going
Yeah.
to be windy and cloudy and crappy, like pretty much every day.
Great fishing weather.
Oh man, I mean, really,
It
you're out there.
is.
It really is like you're swinging big streamers across the natural outlet of one of these
Yeah.
big lakes. You don't want the sun beating down on you all day long. Like,
Hey,
just there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing, right? Just gear
that's
up
right.
and
Gear up and
uh,
go.
right, yeah. I mean, so
Come
and then
prepared. And if I mean, I think really honestly, if you're in the expectation of it, then it does. It makes it quite a bit better. And the reality is, fish are still eating. They're used to that weather down there.
that's right,
Um,
that's right.
so it's part of the natural environment, and you adjust to the natural environment and use your tactics, and you'll have no problem having a great time because you're going to get some good fish.
And honestly, like some of these spring creeks where these fish are real spooky and hide out on the banks most of the day, cloudy day, they'll come out and eat a streamer in the middle of the day. Otherwise, you're stuck to fishing dawn and dusk, basically. Like that's really
Yeah.
the only time you're going to get them. So,
Okay.
I mean, absolutely,
Good.
yeah. And plus, I mean, I sunburn a little easy, so with my red hair here. So
A ginger sunburns? You kidding me?
imagine that, right? Yeah, cloudy days. Hey, I'm all for it. A plus. So going south from there, I do want to make it really clear to people, and I'm not trying to be a worrywart here or trying to baby anybody, but the drive from Esquel southward is treacherous, crazy. Not one that I would recommend doing. There's no center line on the road. There's no margins on the road. Big trucks go straight down the middle. There aren't enough gas stations. You have to bring like several cans of gas with you. At one point, it was so windy that we couldn't pour gas through the funnel into the car. We had to just wait until the wind died down because we
Wow.
physically could not
Yeah.
pour. It was, I mean, it was extremely dangerous. We almost crashed a couple times. Like I would not recommend doing that. Try to fly if you can.
Yeah.
If you're going
It's
to
the
go south.
Wild West. I mean,
Dude, there's
hmm.
no rules. It's terrifying, and your headlights in your car don't work, and like nothing reflects light. There's no signs. Like there's cows in the middle of the road. The fences aren't always up. Like just don't seriously don't do that drive, and definitely don't do it at night.
Yeah.
If you're going to go to the South, fly.
Yeah. And there's we're talking two options here, right? I mean, you're looking at it from the DIY perspective, but there's also lodging and standardized options down in the south as well, where you fly in the location, they take care of you, and et cetera.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
let's keep that in perspective. Now you mentioned the north, you mentioned the south, central region.
Now for the South. So
You so that was the central region what you were talking about, right?
that's I'm sorry,
Okay.
that's still central. Yeah, Chubut
Okay.
province. I would still like that's still the Esquel area. If you want to go south from there, fly, get a package, make sure you have somebody who's gonna take care of you there. The south is I would say like Santa Cruz province and Tierra del Fuego. Um, Santa Cruz province is the capital is Rio Gallegos, which is all the way in the south on the coast. It's really the only city that's Well, I guess El Calafate is nice too, but the coastal cities really aren't that welcoming. If you're on a DIY trip, you might want to keep that in mind.
Hmm.
I wouldn't spend too much time in any of them. But once you get to the south,
Well, dive into that a little. What do you mean they're not accommodating? Is that they
they're
don't? If you're not local, you're not very happy to see you. Is that what you mean?
um,
Or
they're a little rough. They're port cities, and they're just a little
hmm.
rough. They're the only
Okay.
places where I encountered warnings about theft. One hotelier like warned us about even moving stuff from our car to the room. Didn't like it
Okay.
was. So it's just and most of the towns in Patagonia to the west are tourist oriented, and they're very accommodating, very friendly. They're beautiful. They look kind of like Swiss chalet style, but the coast is just a very different story. And some of them, like we got greeted by an actual dumpster fire at the beginning of one town, like that, like welcome to Caleta Olivia, and they just had this big dumpster on fire. So it was
Okay.
just maybe not the kind of place. There was that politician who got in trouble for lying about going down there with his mistress. Said he was like traveling
Oh
the
gosh.
Patagonian coast, and I was like, right away, I was like, no way, dude, that's not where he was. Like, it's not a place anybody would go. But the cool thing about that area is that there are anadromous fish. They come up from the Atlantic Ocean, and there are both steelhead and the sea-run brown trout throughout the southern region of Santa Cruz province and all of Tierra del Fuego. So the southern area is going to be windswept, barren, very similar to like Wyoming or parts of Nevada. Um, it's going to be dirty water. It's going to be like it's either glacial sediment or it's very heavily silted tannic water. And most of the fishing down there is going to be for the anadromous species. There are some really cool little brown trout and brook trout fisheries on Tierra del Fuego. And then there's, of course, like the famous Jurassic Lake area that's in uh, Santa Cruz province. But
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, if you're going to go south, you're going to be targeting anadromous species.
Okay.
January is going to be roughly the peak for the sea run brown trout. And sometime in like late March, early April is going to be the peak for the steelhead in the Santa Cruz.
Mm-hmm. Sea run brown trout. Tell me a little bit about that.
So, this is a really popular pursuit down in Argentina, and if you want to catch a great big brown trout, that's the way to do it. Of all the fishing I did down there, I would rate it as one of the least engaging.
Hmm.
I got into it for a couple days, caught a couple of 20-pound-ish fish, and that was enough for me. You're just kind of swinging sink tip lines. You can't. It's interesting. The rivers are actually small enough to use a single-handed rod, but the wind is so strong that you risk
Hmm.
tying an unknown wind knot in your leader, and you definitely don't want to snap off on a fish like that. So I ended up using
Yeah.
a spay rod. Even this river is like 30 feet wide, but you
Huh.
still want to have a little switch rod because the wind is howling like 40 miles an hour constantly, and it's just way too much to do it with a single hander.
Yeah. You got to keep control of your line. Yeah.
You have to do that, yeah. And so, and I don't know, it was fun. I'm glad I did it, but I thought that like the steelhead fishing on the Santa Cruz was way more dynamic. It was way less known, lots more public water. As a matter of fact, as a testament, I met a whole bunch of guides from the Rio Grande up on the Santa Cruz River after their season had ended in April. Like a lot of them finish up sea run brown trout fishing by immediately heading up to go and do the steelhead instead. So if that tells you anything,
Okay.
um,
Okay.
yeah,
So then tell us a little bit about the steelhead fishing. It
they're
sounds like
so
that's
cool. It's so cool. This is one of my favorite things about Patagonia. If I could go back, this is probably the one thing I would rush to do. They put McCloud River rainbows up in the Lago Argentino, which is up by El Calafate by the famous glaciers. And there wasn't enough food in the system. And so my impression is that they swam, I think it's like 400 miles down the Santa Cruz River, which is this massive glacial river. I mean,
yeah.
by the mouth, it's almost a kilometer wide in some places. Like you can't see the other side sometimes when you're fishing. I mean,
Wow.
I cannot overstate the size of this river. And it comes down and meets the Atlantic Ocean. And apparently, these fish have been observed all the way up against the shore of Brazil. They make like a 3,000-mile loop all through the southern Atlantic and then come
Wow.
back during their fall, March and April, to spawn. And I could be wrong about this, but I'm under the impression that that's the only place in the world where there is a run of Atlantic steelhead.
Hmm. And
and they're
they got
super
to be
cool.
hot. I mean, they got to
Oh
be
my
just,
God. I mean, I hooked one at one point. I had a single-handed rod. I was like way undergunned. My other one was broken. The wind was in my face, and I remember the line stopped, and I thought to myself, I didn't think it was that shallow out there, because I was half asleep. And that fish started porpoising back towards the ocean. And I've got 3 or 4 friends around me that I need to alert at this point, like, hey, I've got a fish on, get the net, let's go. And I
yeah.
can't make any noise. It was like a dream where you're trying to scream and you can't. And I'm just watching line fly off the reel, watching this fish I mean, as fast as it could possibly go across the surface back towards the ocean. And it finally one of my buddies saw it and started yelling because I was completely just stunned, just breathless. Like, it was one of the coolest. That was April 20th, 2007. I still remember exactly. I mean, that's burned in.
Burned.
It was
Yeah.
so cool. Yeah, they're pretty rare, and it's pretty. You feel so stupid out there trying to cast a little fly rod out. You can't even see the other side of the river. The wind in
Yeah.
your face, casting about 40 feet out there, maybe just like, oh yeah, like this is going to work. But because the water's so turbid, they actually cruise up the edges. That's where the
Okay.
least sprint is, and they feel totally safe. I mean, they can be in like less than a foot of water. You cannot see them. So if you ever do go, tread softly on the banks. That's my tip for that fishery.
Okay.
Because we spooked a few of them
Okay.
from like right off the shore.
Um, all right. So we talked a little bit of steelhead. We talked a little bit of sea run browns. I mean, those are like the big, like, wow, okay, this is something unique for that area. But the the dry fly fishing is very unique as well. Let's talk a little bit about that. It's probably a little more uniform from region to region, right? You can get it in each zone. Is that true or not?
I didn't do much dry fly fishing in the South, man. I'll be honest.
Okay.
That you can there are some little brookie streams in Tierra del Fuego if you're willing to walk, where you can go and fish like Chernobyl ant type patterns and catch little fish. But the dry fly fishing is probably best in the north and
Okay.
maybe a little bit in the center zone too.
Okay. And
One
so,
thing that I really struggled with coming from Colorado is that I'm used to when fish won't take, I go smaller. I get more technical, right? Like, oh, that fish didn't want that. That was a 16. We're going to 18. Oh, we're going to 20. 6X,
yeah.
7X. I was trying to get more and more technical. So I'm standing on this spring creek in December when I first got into Patagonia, and I could see rising fish. And it's time, So I put this little parachute on, this tiny little tippet. Nothing. Just drifting right past them. I mean, they're almost like nudging it out of the way to go get something else. And it was like, man. And so I just kept getting this smaller and smaller and smaller, and I couldn't catch anything. And so finally I got frustrated. I bit my leader off about, halfway down the thing and just tied this giant Chernobyl ant on. And my goal was to actually just slap it down and spook all these jerks because they wouldn't eat my
Right.
dry fly. It's the very first cast, man. I smacked it down, and this brown trout just jumped on top of it and actually ate it from above.
Right.
And I learned really quickly that the bigger the better, man. I mean, it was I was tying Chernobyl ants on like size 6 hooks and just going out there and slapping them down on the water as hard as I could. And you would see wakes come from several feet away. These fish would just come and blast it. It was, you really
Oh,
got to
wow.
you got to adjust your whole approach because the technical side, not to say that there weren't times where there was some technical fishing there, but dude, no, they want a meal. Like, don't
Yeah.
mess around.
Yeah. Did you find that the prolific bug life that you had mentioned earlier in the north, is the size significantly larger? You kind of compared, hey, that's a little more like the western waters, et cetera. But
They're not as small as the bugs here in Colorado for sure. I mean, we regularly get size 20 mayflies, and I didn't see anything
right,
like that.
yeah,
I would say fairly standard stuff, especially up north. I mean, just like a size 16 parachute Adams is, or a little, just standard caddisfly is just gonna. Little beetles were really good for me too up there.
hmm.
And that's not to say that the fish in the north won't eat some of the bigger terrestrials too, but it just it seems like it's a kind of a fine line. I will say there's a specific type of tree worm that grows in the willow trees. They call them sauce trees, and it's this little green inchworm, very brightly colored, and they constantly drop from the trees. This happens about January, like in the middle of summer. So this is one benefit if you are going to be in the north in the summertime. Like late, I think it's late January, early February when this really peaks. But trout get stupid for these things. I mean, I
Yeah,
was catching like 20 plus inch trout with bow and arrow casts walking along some of these rivers, and you see them just up against the banks, and the willow trees are so dense that really all you can do is just kind of flick your fly down into there. But like they go nuts for that kind of stuff. So I mean, dry fly fishing in the north is really like, if that's what you want to do, that's where you need to be.
Okay. Yeah, you're all the PA guys and those Eastern guys with the green weenies are going nuts right now. I got a box full of that stuff.
Oh man, I had some bright green wire with me, and I made them out of wire, and they crushed it.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, really, like, that's a really fun fishery. You can get those fish to come up for a lot of different things. There's also there's a tree flea that comes out later in the fall, maybe in March, and they're called pulgones de sauce, literally tree flea. And I was using an all black renegade or any kind of little cluster fly pattern, and they were just crushing it. If you catch a fish that's got a red stain in its mouth, you know that that's what they do.
Oh,
and they
interesting.
will focus on those exclusively for a little while. Like, I could not buy a fish on anything but that for a little while. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And that was March that happened.
So it sounds like you could head down there with a very, for lack of a better term, bland classic fly box, right? And be quite successful.
Totally set. I mean, like the olive woolly booger is going to imitate a Pancora crab about as well as anything. That was one of our top flies. Slap some white rubber legs on it if you feel like making an improvement, but otherwise, I mean, you could probably just catch all those fish on a woolly booger alone. I mean, it really, except for those few times when they get picky on, they get
the
focused
local
on certain
stuff.
things. But honestly, like, you don't really need anything special down there. Chernobyl ants, though, I would definitely bring those wherever I was going. They were really a hot ticket, and a lot of fun to fish too. I mean, come on, who doesn't like that?
Yeah, exactly. I love the, take a bunch of atoms in 4 or 5 sizes and a Sharpie or 2, it's like you can get anything done there. Okay, I got my mayflies covered, I'm going to tie, again, 3, 4 sizes of caddis, right? And then, like you said, okay, what are the key terrestrials I'll take? Well, I'll take some Chernobyl ants, maybe 1 or 2 sizes, and some beetles and some ants, period. And you're like, okay, sweet. So,
I mean, I was catching, God, I caught most of my fish on like rabbit strip, I would say, like black rabbit strip or olive rabbit strip. Just
streamers. I left streamers out of that, but you could just woolly buggers. I'm a big articulate guy. I love throwing big streamers. Like, why not? Take my
those
olives
work really well in the still waters, in the lakes. We had some big articulated black leeches, and the fish really seemed to like those against the weeds. They call them juncos, and a big black articulated leech right against the edge of those was super effective for us in a lot of different places.
Yeah, and it sounds like if you were going to do a DIY and you were going to explore a lot of areas, from what you had discussed, my interpretation was take a single hand rod that covers a lot of ground, maybe a 5-weight or something like that. But then also take some level of a Skagit or spay rod as well, because you're going to have some lake fishing, you're going to have some wind, you're going to have some backcast issue scenarios. And really, with those 2 kind of setups, you could cover the majority of the water very competently. Is that a correct assumption?
It is. You really could. I don't know if the thing is that if you have a problem with your gear, if it breaks, if you lose it, if it gets stolen, whatever, it's very, very difficult to replace there, and very expensive. Despite the shape of their economy, imports have like a triple tax on them last I checked. And so I was seeing prices in like $2,000 for some of these higher end rods there. So definitely, like, if you're doing a DIY trip, the more backups you can bring, the better. And you can actually trade, or at least in my experience, I was able to trade a lot of my rods for float trips or for, other type of access to stuff, because they're in really high demand there. So I would bring as many as you as you feel comfortable bringing.
Right.
I mean, the airlines don't care. I tape them all together, or I mean, maybe you got a fancy rod carrier or something, but I think I taped like 6 or 8 tubes together and carried it on. They didn't
load it on. Yeah. Okay.
Just
all right. That's great to know. It's really good to know. All right.
I got a lot of mileage out of my 4-weight. I was not expecting that. I've been told, you know, it was mostly going to be like 6-weight territory, maybe even some 8-weight action. That was true, but I got so much use out of that 4-weight. If you could bring a shorty, because a lot of those spring creeks are just, you know, they're small, they're subtle. The fish are spooky. Like having something that's lightweight and more flexible like that was a
Mm-hmm.
real benefit. I would definitely include a lighter weight, more flexible rod.
Okay. It's good to know. You know, anything else about the Argentina environment that we should be aware of that maybe caught you by surprise?
Hmm. Um. What, you know, I was surprised by how nice the fall was. I really expected the weather to close in, the snow to start coming. You know what I mean? When you start getting into like the second half of April and you're way down south.
Mm-hmm.
Actually found it to be really pleasant. Might have just gotten a good year, but yeah, I was surprised by how late into the season you can fish and still be fairly comfortable. And I
Hmm.
really like that time of year too. That's good for the migratory brown trout. There are migratory browns that come out of the freshwater lakes,
Okay.
especially in that central district by Bariloche. And so April's a great time to get after them. There aren't as many tourists, and it doesn't feel as risky as the spring in terms of weather. So I was surprised by how stable and how welcoming that was.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. Yeah. All right. So let's switch it up here. We're
Okay.
going to go from Argentina
to
to
naturally,
salt,
yeah, of
to
course, as one does.
right streams and saltwater. I think that's the glory of your diversity, right? Is that you can do that. So it is a common topic, right? I'm a trout fisherman or a stream fisherman, and I have aspirations to go saltwater fishing. And that usually constitutes a significant investment. I have to invest time, I have to invest usually some type of monetary value in equipment,
Yep.
even if it's, I just got to get boots and things like that. And I'm going to borrow the rod and everything from the lodge. But I usually need to get, you know, whatever clothing and stuff for the trip.
Sure.
Uh, and then there's the expense of the actual trip because I'm probably going to get guided. Even if I do a DIY, I got to get there, yada, yada, yada. So there are misconceptions. You've been made aware of a lot of those, and you've written these articles about that. So, kind of give us a background on the articles and where we might find them. And then
Sure.
let's dive into some of what you would think be the top tier items to think about.
Okay, so I got inspired to write these articles after moving to Florida. I thought I was a pretty good fisherman. You know, I'm the fly guy. I can definitely get it done. And I went down there and it was just awful for like 2 or 3 years. The learning curve was so shallow. It was so difficult. It was not what I expected at all. And come to find out, my fly fishing skills were like a smaller part of the equation than I had figured that they would be. And so
Hmm.
it was a huge adjustment to get this figured out. And then I became president of the fly fishing club in Sarasota. And so we would get new members every month. And it was like the same questions. It was the same struggles. It was the same deal. Like somebody was a trout fisherman in Pennsylvania and they retired to Florida and they wanted to come down here and fish, but gosh, they were having trouble, you know? And so
Hmm.
eventually I kind of got used to giving the same speeches over and over again. And so I decided to turn that into a series of articles on the Orvis fly fishing blog called Stream to Salt. And
Okay.
you can go to the blog and just search the term stream to salt, and you'll find, gosh, I think there's 9 of them at this point.
Okay.
Um, and they each deal with a specific tip that is designed specifically for trout anglers, and it's little misconceptions, it's little ways. It's not so much about technique, like practice your cast to be able to cast 60 feet. It's not about that. It's about how to change your mind, how to understand how the goals are different, how the scenarios are different, and how you need to shift some of your really deeply seated assumptions about fishing in order to be more successful in the salt. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples to kind of ground this discussion.
Okay.
The first one, chapter 1, is don't wait to rig up. So you hear
Hmm.
this from a lot of trout fishing circles, like you don't want to put flies on the car. You want to get your rod ready and then get down to the river and have a look. A lot of good guides will say sit for 5 minutes look around, try to figure out, what the vibe is, what the river's doing, what's hatching, and then decide how you're going to approach it. That makes tons of sense if you know where the fish are going to be all the time and they're not going to
Mm-hmm.
move very far, right? They're kind of a captive audience there. You show up in
Right.
a nice hole in the river, you're going to have fish there. It's a question of showing them what they want. In the saltwater, you are really going to suffer if you take that approach because opportunities come and go so quickly. I mean, like I've had instances where I'm loading the boat at the ramp and like a school of jacks blows through. And like that's my biggest opportunity for the whole day. It turns out that was going to be my best cast of the whole day, and my rod's in the holder with no fly on it.
Yeah.
And
It's
so,
it's
dude,
it's
and
funny
it's
you brought that up because I never thought of, I mean, I pre-rig on salt. Like I always have,
oh,
it's a bait pattern or some type of shrimp or something,
doesn't matter,
crab,
just
whatever. But
something,
like you said, I never thought of it from that perspective of, yeah, trout fishermen might do that. They might wait to get rigged.
right?
But I'm
And
usually like, okay, we're going out today. I got a predator rod, I got a bonefish rod, and I got a permit rod. It's like they're all rigged with something ready to go.
ready to go. Another one would be if at first you don't succeed, the best course of action in the saltwater is to change locations, keep moving. Like
Mm.
90% of that water is vacant 90% of the time, they say, and that's accurate. Whereas a trout fisherman is going to be tempted to do the opposite, right? Like if they're
Mm-hmm.
thwarted, if they get to the river and they don't catch anything, like I was saying earlier, smaller flies, smaller tippet, they're going to go more technical. They're going to try a different pattern. They're going to try a different approach, maybe streamers over dries, whatever it is, and they're going to beat that water down. Another thing that contributes to that is that there's a lot of private water when it comes to trout fishing. And so if you get to a hole, you might not have the luxury to just start walking. There might be a person above you and below you. So you got to make the most of but in saltwater, that's not the case. And if you
Yeah.
start trying to focus, if you start switching flies when you're fishing a patch of water with no fish in it, like I've seen people just completely go down the wrong path, and then they're asking the wrong questions at the meetings. Like, well, what color fly is the best, dude? It doesn't matter. The one that gets in
Yeah.
front of a fish is the one that's going to get eaten. Like if
Yeah.
if your flies aren't getting eaten, the color is not the issue. And so
Yeah.
it's really a question of having to just change your mind and just cover as much water as possible. And sometimes I'll fish the same fly all day. That's not what matters. So
Yeah.
it's
In saltwater, you chase the fish.
yeah,
In
yes,
freshwater, it's like you chase the hatch almost. It's totally different. Like, I love how you correlated it to their captive audience earlier,
yeah,
right? They're captive in a lake or in a stream, in a hole, and there are fish in that hole. So if I continue to change my technique, I should be able to entice one. Whereas in saltwater, they're there or they're not there.
or they're not.
and
And like
and in saltwater, you are sight fishing. The blind casting, even when it's blind casting, you're blind casting to a mud or something that is an indicator that there are fish there.
educated, I call it educated blind
Yes,
casting. Yes,
it's a different scenario. So I
totally
might
different.
blind cast to a reef because I know there's a bunch of fish sitting on the reef, or I have that belief. But the same kind of thing, you said, I'm going to put a handful of casts in there and I'm going to move on.
Yes.
And that's a desperate day on saltwater if you're doing that, right? I mean,
Well,
it's a
don't
desperate, like,
blind cast. I mean, like that's another thing. These trout anglers, they just get to a bridge and they're like, "Oh, this looks juicy. There's got to be fish here." Or they listen to a bait guy who's like, "Oh yeah, you want to take your boat to this spot, and drop a line here." Well, that works for him, but that's not a fly spot. I mean, that's
yeah.
another thing that I had to kind of get over was that like the conventional wisdom about where the good fishing places are, a lot of it just doesn't apply to fly anglers. You kind of got to find your own.
Yeah, and
And
it's
then
usually a different type of fish. I mean, baitcaster, he's fishing for rockfish or something, and you're fishing for, some other jack, or it's like a totally different scenario.
or the redfish, like the redfish in Tampa Bay, for example, they get more comfortable when they're in 6 or 7 feet of water at the bottom of a hole. So they'll eat a topwater plug or they'll eat a jig a lot more readily when they're in that scenario. They're really hard to fly fish when they're in that much water. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like going out there, I spent an embarrassing number of hours like out there with the bait guys thinking that was where the fish were and that was how we did this, and not realizing that like as a fly angler I needed to be on a different tide at a different place. I mean, those fish don't just sit there the whole time. Like you got to find the times and the places where they're going to be in better fly water, and even just, it sounds simple to say, but that takes a lot of doing. I mean, that takes a lot of realization.
Yeah. You had another one that you were getting ready to jump into.
Yeah. Yeah.
I see you clicking through, trying to figure out, hey, let me give him one more.
One more. And so and this is something else that I think really plays to the difference between trout fishing and saltwater fishing, and that is the issue of fly design. A lot of trout anglers are going to be attracted to flies that look like the prey they're trying to imitate. Look at how much this fly looks like a shrimp. Man, look at the tentacles and the eyes, and you see some of these super elaborate patterns. In my experience, like, not only does that not matter at all, but sometimes it's actually self-defeating, because what really matters is how the fly moves through the water, how it performs, how it moves through the air, whether it can be cast without tangling, whether it has a weed guard that's going to help it from getting snagged on the bottom, if it's properly weighted so that it gets down without making too much of a splash, if it lacks, if it doesn't have too much flash that's going to turn the fish off. Like, you have to really shift gears and realize that it honestly does not matter what a saltwater fly looks like. It matters how it swims, how it performs, how durable it is, and you really have to change your entire evaluation of what makes a good fly pattern, because it turns out that the best saltwater flies don't really look like like, what does a gotcha look like? I mean,
Right.
Why is a Clouser minnow still one of the best imitations when a Puglisi EP looks so much more like a minnow? It's because of the way they swim, the way they perform, and that's always going to be more important, I think.
Yeah, and I would second that with your notation on how you're making the fly perform. An example is crabs and shrimp. They swim totally different.
They do. They
A
do.
shrimp is a short little jetting strip. Strip, strip, strip. A crab, what's a crab do? Crab goes
Slow.
really slow, might climb and flutter for a little bit, and then it'll settle down. And there's uniqueness about both of those, and you see it all the time, where you're permit fishing, for example, with a crab, and the guide will say, stall it. Well, what does a crab do? A crab runs, it crawls, it has a predator coming, it starts to swim away, settles in, and it tries to camouflage. Right? Well, I mean, if you start to look and monitor those different types of baits, I would say, or food, it can drastically improve your ability to entice a fish to eat. Because I think, like you said, there's so many varieties of food in the ocean, and the colors are so varying, and the sizes are so varying, and the movement is so varying. But there are certain characteristics that are very consistent, and that's the way a shrimp swims, the way a crab swims, the way a bait fish may swim, or locations, how they work with the currents and things like that. So, yeah, I really like that tip that you had mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how realistic your bait fish is, if you move it towards a game fish, it's going to flee.
Yeah,
because they don't move that way. It's that same idea.
That's perfect. Remember the first time fishing for lemons in lemon shark, and the guide I was with said, "Don't ever bring your fly towards the head of the shark." He's like, "It's a predator. No bait fish is going to swim towards a shark." He's like, "It always has to be moving away." And I just never, because I was a trout guy, and I was thinking, I'm going to get that in front of his face and drift it in front of him, and no, he's going to hammer it. He's a predator. And he's like, no, he is a predator. He knows if that thing's coming through, it ain't real.
Man, I can't tell you. I spooked a whole school of tarpon a couple years ago doing that accidentally. Just underestimated the tide strength and got the bait fish swimming the wrong way. And man, that lead fish turned around and just bolted. It was like an elephant running from a mouse,
Yeah, very cool. Well, hey, Evan, your experience with both the salt and freshwater, and of course your adventure in Argentina, I hope someday you get to go back and replicate that in at least some form or fashion. And you really educated us today on that region. But I love those little tips too, because people could take those home and really use those. So thanks again for being on the show, man. If you guys are ever in town around Evan, apparently he has a notion for inviting you into his home and staying for weeks and fishing with you. Little side story there. But again, Evan, thanks for being on the show, bud. We'll see you guys next week, okay?
Hey, man, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet, man. We'll get you back again. We're going to hear some more about Argentina, I'm sure. It's either going to be my trip or yours.
All right. I'll look forward to it.
Okay, bud. See you later.